As streaming continues to remake the TV advertising landscape, the myriad platforms and confusion over measurement and currencies can make the prospect of buying ads seem daunting, particularly for smaller agencies and challenger brands. Joining me today to discuss strategies to help small agencies leverage direct and programmatic buying and drive growth is Mike Fogerty, Head of Agency Partnerships at Tatari. Welcome to Small Agency, Mike.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you guys making the time, and hope you guys are looking forward to talking TV.
Awesome. I wish we had a T-shirt cannon or something. We could fire it into the crowd. All right, let's get into it. So TV. All right. Well, you know, you are the head of agency partnerships. So what are the primary challenges that you're hearing from small agencies? What do they face when it comes to TV buying? And give us some ideas of how they can overcome these challenges.
Sure, and I will preface that I'm aware that there's definitely a lot of flavors of agency disciplines in this room, right? So there might not necessarily be a media element, but I still think that all agencies have an opportunity to lean into television in a form and function. And so for me, it really starts the build, borrow argument, right? We just heard about this on stage up here about in-housing P&L and not giving away fees or trying to kind of protect against margin compression. And so generally when small agencies struggle, it's because they don't have a 20-year investment or planning team or that experience. They don't have television buying infrastructure. And as you guys can all appreciate with agencies, you have to license an immense amount of partnerships, whether it's order management systems, it's ad server source of truth, it's buying platforms, it's measurement currencies. It can be very comprehensive and very complex, and in some cases very daunting. And so the way that we've looked at it is, as the world is digitized and democratized, especially in the world of television, there is at least light at the end of the tunnel on the horizon, in the sense that there are technologies like us that are unifying those spectrums end to end, where we're helping you build in-house self-service disciplines, where you're creating automation in those workflows and trafficking and all the execution and measurement, where you can use a unified command center to streamline efficiencies and costs. So that's where I feel like we're trying to coach and consult them, but definitely building a new discipline can be scary.
Let's talk about direct versus programmatic. So how would you recommend the small agencies, I mean, obviously to explain the differences between the two and you know, what the challenges are there, but how can they leverage both direct and programmatic TV buying to drive real business outcomes?
I love this question. It's one of my favorite conversations to get into, because I think it's also very misunderstood in the world of television. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of articles about this, so I want to kind of break this down to John's point. So when John says direct, right, we're talking about traditional direct IOs and direct insertion orders, where you're working directly with a television network or publisher. And that could be a remnant spot that was unsold, or you could be doing a more turnkey, high-impact execution, such as a custom slate in Yellowstone on Paramount, because you know that your audience is there, and those are non-programmatic biddable units, so you would have to work directly with a network or a technology like us. Programmatic, I think, as most know, is about choice. And so you're generally going to buy through a demand-side platform. There's many of them out there that are tapping into the streaming and connected television space. And so those are usually the easiest ways for agencies to get on, because usually within the click of a button, you're just adding a different device type or an inventory source. So naturally, that's where you start. But there's a lot of data out there, specifically from two major ad servers that are primarily functional in TV, both FreeWheel and Innovid, that have both somewhat underscored that 60% of all television monetization is still direct sold. That means only 40% is programmatic. And so when you think about the streaming ecosystem and your addressability of reaching outcomes and reach and frequency and driving those fidelities for clients, if you're only buying programmatic, you are missing a material component on the direct side. And so what I'm really saying here is that they should coexist. There's a reason to do both. And for me, I really look at direct as the media efficiency side versus programmatic as the hyper addressable, because we're going to get to cost a little bit in a few minutes. But with direct, in many cases, if you're talking about just spot buys, it's much more cost efficient to do that from a supply path, because you don't have all the taxes from programmatic. So just food for thought there.
Okay. Well, you talked about, so we're talking about linear and streaming. So let's talk about the advantages of the whole idea of convergent TV, which combines both linear and streaming data. You know, and also keep in mind that, so for example, Netflix recently, they've kind of switched tacks, and they're going fully into programmatic. You mentioned, although 60% is still in linear. So why the change in strategy for Netflix? Keep that to answer that question, keep that in mind.
Yeah, sure. And so actually, real quick, I want to do a little quick exercise with the crowd to help answer this question, if you guys can help entertain me. So if you guys are familiar with the virtual MVPD, that's a virtual multi-video programming distributor, think YouTube TV, Hulu Live, or Sling. Can you guys in the audience raise your hand if you license one of those or watch TV on one of those platforms? Okay, good. Quick check. There's probably about 60% now, but sorry, keep your hands up real quick. How many of you, and be honest here, there's no right or wrong answer, but I'm going to get there. How many of you in your personal classification would define those as streaming platforms? Keep your hand up. Okay. So thank you for that, by the way. And so to answer this question, right, the importance of convergent TV, which is that intersection of both linear streaming and direct and programmatic, is that when you think about those platforms, majority of where that content is coming from is actually still linear broadcast. But a lot of people assume it's streaming because it's over internet protocol. So when you think about how they're accessing that content, they're doing carriage and retrans fees and rights. And so when you basically take an hour of content and broadcast, you have about 14 minutes of that in those apps that are still broadcast traditional linear, with 2-minute carve-outs for streaming monetization. And so when we go back to the convergent argument, that's why agencies have to take a convergent approach, because again, you may be thinking you're buying streaming in those, which you are for a certain degree, but 14 minutes of that literally is still coming from traditional linear. So you have the opportunity to bring a lot of your brands, whether they're a D2C commerce brand or a Fortune 500, onto the big screen for the first time through very tactical, interesting ways. And so for us, again, being able to unify that ecosystem, whether traditional linear spots or, again, buying into those types of virtual programming, or really where streaming is accelerated, it's both fast, so free ad supporting streaming TV services, or of course the AVOD tier, where to your point, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon, soon to be YouTube, everybody has created different ad tiers now with ad load. And for the most part, Americans are generally okay with highly targeted qualified ads and paying less of a vig to access that content. And I think what you're seeing with Netflix is just that, right? And so I think Netflix obviously still has a very big SVOD, so a subscription VOD practice where there isn't advertising. And they're, of course, talking in their earnings a lot about their AVOD tier. And again, they're a bit ambiguous in terms of what those numbers are. And I think the latest was it's growing 34% over the base, and so that's a healthy clip. But they've realized that they have to start offering these tiers because content is expensive. And so they have to have an odd model to fund that content and also to retain, again, subscriber churn, which is very high.
Okay, well, let's focus a little bit on we said driving growth. So can you give me some examples of small agencies successfully using TV buying to grow business and retain clients?
Sure. I have 3 that come to mind. The first of which is Socium. It's actually a public case study that we just released on our website. So traditionally, Socium, like probably many in this room, were a boutique digital endemic. They maximized search and social. That was the fabric of their DNA, and they had never really delved into television. They had done some spot streaming buys with some other DSP platforms, but they really weren't successful there. And so now virtually completely licensing us, they've now launched a couple brands. They're actually tapping into linear traditional for the first time. They're also now doing both direct and programmatic through us. And so we've been able to help them drive a lot of reach and lift and fidelity by, in some cases, reducing cost to those direct transactions. Another is Merino Media Group, a bit different because they were more in the traditional space already, but their biggest issue was that they had a hard time with tactical measurement, because measuring TV is very difficult, right? When we think about streaming, a lot are still using a view through currency, which is a start, but we are very focused at Tatari on an outcome-first mindset. And when we talk about outcomes, we're talking about CAC, ROAS, ROI, unique site visitation, and app download. GRPs and reach and frequency still matter in TV. There's a time and a place for those, but really we're fixated on driving material outcomes because in the end, your performance agency, whether it's brand or actual performance, right? You are retained for the integrated surplus that you can deliver for your partners. And so for Merino, they were looking for more incremental based measurement and dynamic measurement across the convergent TV space. And so we found a lot of good rhythm with that. And then the other I would actually say, and this is another fun one, where Adcology, if you're familiar with them, they actually were in the terrestrial audio podcast space. Again, they had never done television, but the reason they came to the epiphany was because they got 30 RFPs in a single year for their partners asking them, can you do TV? And Matt, the president of Adcology, was handing those 30 RFPs off and all of that margin opportunity to friends and family or his competition. And just last week, I had another conversation with the CEO in the exact same construct where he didn't have the in-house expertise. So he did have strategic alliances with 2 other TV agencies, and it was a rev share. But in the end, he realized that he could in-house that infrastructure, and that margin could be retained for themselves. And there was a lot of raw value creation. So I think that would be my call to action to the audience here, is that whether you're a creative agency, you're a media agency, you're a strategy agency, it really has never been easier to simply license a self-service technology and get onto television very seamlessly. And so, yeah, that's kind of been a few success stories for us.
So do you think it's more a matter of perception, or is it versus, what is the difference between the proportion between perception and fiscal reality, between the difficulty to get into TV, it's holding people back?
There's definitely a high caliber perception of barrier, and I think mostly because the holding companies have dominated television over the years, right? And I think when you think about the upfronts, their carve-outs, their rate of change, because they can take this $18 billion media tonnage and they can provide very good rate compression and fidelity and access, and TV was only for the Fortune 500s. But again, going back to my earlier comment on democratization, it is really prolific right now in the way that apps are getting off the ground and content is being surfaced, and going back to these advertising tiers for the first time. Those were otherwise previously unreachable audiences that were SVOD. So you had no way of physically communicating with those prospects or existing customers. And so I do think now it's becoming more palatable for agencies to realize that I can make it very digital and modern-like. I don't have to treat it like a GRP-based panel on these legacy dated metrics. Again, they matter because they're vanity, they're still health metrics, and in some cases when you're buying, let's say, the Olympics, or you're buying the Super Bowl, you're buying tune-in. So you are buying a gross rating point in the end of the day. You hope that that drives spike in the halo effect, but I think that there's been a lot of data that is also empirically validating the halo effect of television, that it increases search queries and unaided awareness and quality scores. It's increasing the commerce carts in Amazon. It's bringing more footfall and foot traffic into stores. And I think because we have the data now behind this and we can track it in a more digital-like way, it's easier to justify for agencies to in-house.
Okay, you mentioned cost before, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of actually doing this. So how can small agencies navigate the perceived high cost and complexity of TV advertising to make it accessible and effective for their clients?
Yeah, so I go back to the direct element again. So the way that we think about this at Tatari is that because of the replatforming from linear to streaming, rates are coming down because the viewership and ratings are changing. You might not believe what I'm about to say, but I do want to share some data behind it that in the linear biddable spot space, you can actually buy spots for anywhere from $1 to $7. And I want to make sure that it's clear that when I'm saying remnant, I'm not necessarily talking about a tier 3 overnight spot or impression. In many cases, because you're seeing the viewership changes, these spots on tier 1 networks like HGTV, BET, TLC, they're becoming available at even $6 to $7 sight, sound, and motion pricing. In some cases, that might be what you're paying for online video, vertical video, a static display banner. And so when we're coaching up and designing experiments for a lot of our partners, we usually will start them in at least the linear space because they realize the massive efficiencies and the difference, again, in traditional linear and streaming. When you buy a spot in national linear, we are all concurrently seeing it in this audience at the same time, right? So there's a lot of spike, there's a lot of analysis that goes to the website and signal, whereas streaming is more prime time, as we know, right? It's very impression by impression to ourselves and our devices. And so on the flip side, again, we'll usually then to also start talking about direct streaming because you're mitigating a lot of those ad tech taxes in between. So very often when you're buying programmatically, you're buying through a supply-side platform. Those SSPs generally take 10 to 30% tax in between. The DSPs have pre-bids for fraud and filtering and post-bid reporting. So all of those non-working costs can upwards capital up to 30%. So when you start to compound that dollar in effect and a dollar out, right, your media isn't necessarily working as hard. And I want to be clear, we do programmatic. I personally hail from programmatic. There is a great reason that it exists today, so I'm not here knocking it. But going to the price question, when I was at Trade Desk and Roku selling Hulu, we were selling Hulu around $28 to $35 on a dynamic PMP. At Tatari, I can get you Hulu at $12 because we have a direct, vast integration into Disney's ad server, where we're sitting above programmatic waterfall, and you get that direct connection to Disney. And so it's those types of things where we're coaching, again, partners to, again, not be feared by cost and just think about it a little bit more holistic and integrated.
Okay, we have a little bit under a minute left. Can you just said you're coaching your partners. Can you just give some best practices on how to approach clients and persuade them about the value of investing in TV?
Yeah, I would say that, I like to always think back to 1941. The first television ad, which is a Belovia watch commercial, was the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Philadelphia Phillies that were playing. And
oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, just a little bit 10-second ad, it was around. And but to me, right, like television has always been a force multiplier that drives prestige, brand recognition, experimentation, and trial for brands. And when we fast forward today, most US adults are still spending 3 hours per day consuming content, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for you to be in front of those partners. And so I would always encourage, agencies to not be afraid of getting into television, realizing that there's an opportunity to drive outcomes holistically and combine that with search and social and these other channels that you're doing. So that's probably a big takeaway.
All right, well, that's all the time we have. And Mike Fogerty from Tatari, thanks for joining us
Thanks,
today.
man.
And thank you.